David? David, can you put the link in on the Facebook post? And I'll just put that down. Done. Well, hello everyone, and oh yes, there's my camera. Hi everyone, welcome to today's Zoom topic, which is actually on baroque performance practice, and specifically focusing on a treatise which is not as well known. It's by Tromlitz, and it was focusing on flute. It's a little bit later than quants, and so it gives us a bit of an insight into the Galant era and how to interpret those really early classical and Galant compositions. David is going into the Facebook group, I hope, and he's going to put the link in. So if you want to come and join us in the Zoom room, feel free. So we'll share. And excellent. So just looking at who wrote this treatise, so Johann Tromlitz, he was a son of a Polish grenadier, or a soldier that uses grenades, and he was German. So his dates are 1725 to 1809, so a classical venturing to the end of the Baroque through to the classical, venturing, touching on the end of the very end, beginning of the Romantic. He married Maria Christina in 1747, and they had 5 children together. They gave concert tours, and in 1776 he retired from performance to devote the rest of his life to teaching and the manufacture and design of the flute. And he actually wrote another treatise specifically on the flute manufacture, which is also very brilliant, but it's also very expensive. So I haven't got my hands on that yet. So Tromlitz did some, Tromlitz did some amazing work on the flute key work. He was always aiming to try and get the balance of perfect intonation as well as a strong and agreeable tone. So this is before the modern flute with its rods and its keys that is often credited to Boehm, although that is quite questionable about whether Boehm plagiarized it or whether that was actually his own concept. But this early era, it was almost like they were putting random keys on the flute as they were trying to, and other woodwind instruments, as they're trying to go, what mechanisms are going to work in order to get a flute that is matching our modern ideals, as in that classical era ideals of what we want a flute to do. So Tromlitz felt there was too many keys on the flute, and it sort of looked like a dog's breakfast with a key sticking out here and a key sticking out there and a key sticking out there. Actually, I have one that I could show, but now I don't know where it is. Do you know where that flute I got from the museum is? Can you just check the kitchen bench? Of course, a flute that you pick up from a museum would be on the kitchen bench, but it's not there. Doesn't matter. It's just quite random. And Tromlitz is going, wait a second, how can we make this more easy to maneuver? And his ideas really did influence the direction that woodwind manufacture would go. He could foresee the keys. See, with the Baroque flute, there are dull notes and there are bright notes, and that was an important value in the Baroque era when each key had its own affect or emotion attached to it. But as we're heading closer to the modern era, people want this omnitonic idea. We've often talk about it with equal temperament, and so he's going, well, actually no, I want all notes to be equally beautiful and resonant, and I want more accurate intonation. Accurate now being a different concept to what it was on previous intonation tuning systems. So why this treatise? So this treatise is giving us insight into flute performance practice in the second half of the 18th century. And it's very similarly organized to quants. And to be fair, he constantly speaks with quants with respect in the treatise. And he covers, in particular, articulation practices, tone quality, and ornamentation. and really gives an insight into how ornamentation and melodical ornamentation has evolved since our Ganassi treatise, which we covered, I believe we covered, or at least we talked about a little bit a few sessions ago. Why is it worth studying this treatise? Well, compared to other treatises, the English translation of this one is easier to understand. When you're reading quants, it's easy to get bogged down, and quants is really a seminal treatise and well worth the effort. But this one is a lot easier to read, and it's a very thorough treatise. He covers all matters of pedagogy. So what sort of tone is Tromlitz promoting? Well, he's saying what a more open, relaxed tone. And he rejected the T, D, diddle, and preferred a ta, da, duddle, that more open throat sound. And oh yes, I've said open throat next. He described the sound, a good sound, as being well focused and ringing. And if a tone is lacking, if a tone is lacking, then everything is lacking. And you know, this is really something that I feel about teaching. Often I feel that teachers say, oh, look, it's okay, just get them to learn the notes and the rhythm, we'll fix tone later. But Tromlitz's comment, I think, is so true. If tone is lacking, everything is lacking. Right from the beginning, encouraging a good tone. And remember that he's actually trying to redesign the flute to get this open tone and resonant tone on every note. And so he obviously puts that great priority on that. He says to practice the high notes frequently to naturally develop the tone in the lower notes. So practice the high notes to get a good tone in the lower note. He does talk about the personal choice of tone, and if for those who know a little bit about flute positioning, the position was quite turned in many schools of playing, whereas now it's based on the Bohm treatise, which is much more open. But the French playing in particular was quite turned in, and if you want to look at that more, there's the Rockstro position paper that's well worth reading. So he says tone is a personal choice. However, the only model on which an instrumentalist should form his tone is a beautiful voice. Beautiful, full and resonant, of masculine strength, but not, I'm not being gender biased, these are his words, but not shrieking, soft but not hollow, full of timbre, rounded, singing, soft and flexible. So very similar to the sorts of descriptions we would use about tone these days. Beautiful, full, resonant, soft, not hollow. I often use the word pathetic, and I know that sometimes can be used as an insult, but in its real meaning, I often tell students soft still means projected, still needs to be projected and not sounding weak and pathetic. So, and then he talks about one should try and make the high and low registers even with each other. Again, this is a newer value because the difference between the notes was exploited in the early Baroque era for their effects. But now we're heading towards wanting a more consistent tone and a more omnitonic instrument that can play multiple keys and a more equal temperament. So, these are the things he says about posture. Be confident. And most of them are no different to our modern stance. So be confident. Sound and the impression it produces are here very closely bound together. A good free stance can be best acquired in the following way. Stand up straight and relaxed, the feet rather close together, but the left one a little to the front. Hold the head well up and look straight ahead. And it's quite amazing to think that this advice is coming before all our modern medical knowledge. And he says turn the head slightly to the left. A lopsided head position is damaging to the tone and playing, and of course we also know it's damaging to the spine. And he says avoid using the buffet finger, and the buffet finger is where you would basically hold the bottom hole. So if I'm playing a baroque flute or recorder and I just put my finger on to hold the bottom hole, these days we sort of do that anyway with the pinky on the key. He's saying avoid using the buffet finger. The buffet finger can very slightly affect intonation anyway. And he says, as many of us have said to our students, don't put the fingers under the flute. because they won't be available when needed. Guess it's comforting to know that he had to tell his students exactly the same as we have to teach our students now. In teaching embouchure position, he says, put the entire embouchure hole so it covers both lips, and then gradually roll the flute outwards so that it rests firmly on the chin. I haven't actually tried that idea ever with a student. I might have to try it next time to see how it works. And he says avoid contortions such as lifting the shoulders. So it just absolutely mind boggles me that basically it's exactly the same as our modern advice, and we are scientifically and medically, theoretically, so much more advanced. So it's important for the lips to have healthy, supple lips to produce good tone, and not lips that are just spoiled by rich and bitter foods or roughened by the cold. Now really, I just included this because I thought it was quite hilarious. But he says that since lip salve can be difficult to get, here is your own personal lip salve recipe. So some virgin wax, some deer tallow, some sweet almond oil, some raisins, and some grated Bosdorf apple pipins, and some ox tongue root. So if anybody's watching the live stream who wants to actually screenshot that recipe and try it, you can let me know what it's like, or you can just go to the chemist and buy proper lip balm. But it is something I've noticed, that when our lips get dry and cracked, because there's like little flakes of skin, it affects the airstream, and so it interferes with the flow of air, and therefore it affects the quality of the tone. So the importance of using lip salve or lip gloss, what do you call it, lip moisturizer, is still important, and make your own at your own peril. And then he says to avoid the flute slipping, touch your powdered hair or your wig and then wipe that powder on the chin. If anybody does want to do this, could we start a TikTok trend? You can send me the videos. Anyway, okay. So what does he say about intonation? Back to the more, well, I guess he thought it was serious. I feel it's funny, but for him it was serious. Interestingly, with flute slipping, I know some teachers say to put a Band-Aid on the flute if a student has too much sweating. It's not a problem I've had with any of my students so far. So with intonation, he says to turn the flute inwards to maintain intonation when getting louder, or outwards as the note gets softer. And he says to practice long tones to develop pure intonation and improve tone and strengthen breath control. That's no different, is it? Trevor Wise starts with long tones. James Galway taught a friend of mine, and he said that he practiced long tones for an hour a day. You know, long tones do so much. It's such a simple exercise, but achieves so much. And he says, one must not rely merely on fingering of the notes alone, and even if one did finger correctly and had a superlatively, I probably said that wrong, well-tuned flute, it would still be impossible to play in tune unless the ear had been trained first. So do not neglect to train the hearing, and do not put it off to another time, as once the ear is accustomed, it will stay that way. You know, I was learning mixing for uni because I had to learn technology, and it wasn't wasted learning, I guess. But one of the things I noticed is the more times you hear your mix, the more you think it sounds correct. And I was told that professional mixers will listen 3 times then go away, because they don't want the ear to think that is this normal sound. They want to find the best sound. And with students, you know, if they're hearing themselves play out of tune, or they're hearing their windy tone, it's exactly the same, isn't it? Their brain goes, oh, this is normal, this is right. And it stops trying to improve. But we have an advantage over Tromlitz, and that is that we have recordings we can listen to. That's what in tune sounds like. So that we can make sure our ear is trained to hear what in tune sounds like and what good tone sounds like. So we definitely have an advantage in this aspect, but it's still so true. Once the ear is accustomed to an out of tune sound, it assumes it's right, and it makes it harder to get in tune. And even with our modern flutes, with all their mechanism, they're not perfectly tuned either. So we still need to adjust intonation note to note. And he says to use air pressure for intonation and not lip movement, which is funny because earlier he obviously said to turn the flute in and out. But so air pressure rather than lip movement was his thought on that. He also said make sure octaves are in tuned. And Trevor Y and Moyes and those have those octave exercises very early on to try and train the ear to hear them in tune. Now, he talks about the small semitone and the large semitone. So all semitones are the same to us in equal temperament, but the chromatic semitone was smaller than a diatonic semitone in his era, which does affect how we would play his music if we were trying to play it historically accurately. So this earlier treatises that we've covered talk about the G clef being on the lower line. That was called the French, or we call it the French clef. And Tromlitz says in his era, so now we're, it's around 1750 to 1800, this clef is rarely used. So not that much earlier, Hotteterre's treatise, he was still using the French clef. But by this stage, we're starting to head towards modern notation being sort of cemented. He points out that you only use the minim rest in 4/4 time, which is consistent with the engraving rules that pop up in many of the exam boards, although I think that ABRSM theory book says you now can use minim rest in places that Tromlitz would have said you can't. He talks about 2-bar and 4-bar rests, which to us would resemble the old breve and longer rests. So those medieval things were still in his vernacular in this era. He also feels that you should not call a semi-reeve a whole bar rest because it's only sometimes worth a whole bar. Now, for time signatures, we've still got that carry-on from early Baroque eras where time signatures actually indicated tempo to an extent. So he says specifically that 2/2 goes twice as fast as 4/4. He said a few other things, but I didn't think they'd be very relevant to people who are not obsessed with early music. But yeah, so if we see a 2/2, that's a faster time signature than a 4/4. And then he discusses, now I do apologise for where my writing ended up on the scale. So this one here. So he actually discusses that there are issues around this rhythm. And Leopold Mozart didn't say there were issues around this rhythm. So obviously by this stage we are looking at, wait a second, where do we put this quaver? When the semiquaver, do we put this semiquaver in line with that third note, or do we play out afterwards? So it's actually debated. So when we see it, some of the vowelly movements, quite possibly based on earlier treatises, this semiquaver would actually get played along as though it was divided into 3, rather than where we would place it in modern notation. And he says the same thing about 2 against 3. Is where do we put the second quaver? Do we actually put it as what we would now call a polyrhythm? Or is it written this way but actually just align it with the third quaver? So I don't know that it gives an answer, but it definitely gives food for thought as to how do we interpret these rhythms when we see them. It's not set in stone. And then, as we know from earlier treatises, that the heartbeat was used to determine speed. And allegro was 2 beats per heartbeat. But now Tromlitz is saying, well, actually, wait a second, the heart rate's not constant, is it? So maybe this is not a good idea. And then these couple of rhythms are important because they come up a lot, particularly in slow movements. When there's a dotted quaver followed by semiquaver, he suggests that dotted quaver is elongated so much that it's almost a full crotchet, and then that's snapped, the semiquaver is snapped in at the end. We sometimes call this double dotting, particularly with French overtures and things like that. But he's almost as long as possible. And in an andante, the first note should not be so fiery. It should only ever be as fast as the music allows to keep the mood. So if we see this rhythm with the demi-semi, it's not necessarily a literal demi-semi because we have to keep the mood of the piece. I can't see the heading now. Tonguing and articulation. So this, even though the tonguing is specifically aimed towards flute in this case, it does apply even to keyboard instruments in how we process the articulation on the page. So the word tongue stroke, he says, begets the notion that the air must be thrust out by the tongue, but that this does not have and cannot have a good effect. It results in a hard and constipated style of playing, quite out of accord with the nature of good melody. And one consideration I have as he's writing this is that the flute has evolved. So if the flute has evolved, and he's referring to treatises that were earlier in the flute's evolution, then the requirements for how to play it would have changed anyway, even though style has changed as well. So then the air's not thrust out by the tongue. And he again, like I said before, he prefers ta and da over t and d. So he wants that open sound, that resonant sound. And he says to use ta on all single notes, and to use ta or da depending on whether they should be more detached or more connected. So ta for the more detached and da for the more connected. When there's 3 equal notes, like 3 crotchets, the last note should be played shorter. Now, shorter doesn't mean spiky or accented. It just means that there's a silence after it. And he says to use tat when doing staccato. So usually I'd think about doot, but he's saying he wants that R sound. Tart, I guess tart wouldn't be when doing staccato. Then when the strokes over the note mean tar, but with a separated end. Now I've forgotten what this means. Publishers often interchange these, so you have to decide for yourself what is the composer's intention. I think he might be referring to tenutos, but since I wrote this, I've now forgotten which strokes over the note. So I think it might be tenutos, means tar, but separated at the end. But we have to be careful, because even the first editions can be quite heavily edited by the publisher. So he suggests when there are 4 semiquavers in a row, you basically slow them in pairs. So you would articulate as ta, a, ra, a. And then he also talks about inegal, which we so rarely include in our pieces when we're playing these days. And yet it was so commonplace in the baroque, and it obviously here in this early classical galant era. So 2 notes of equal value. The first note is longer than the second by its intrinsic value. It's called long because of the stress or expression or accent falls upon it. And if anyone wants to look more into inegal, in the Couperon webinar, I guess it was 2 months ago, Couperon went into a lot of detail on inegal. He says ta can be used on strong and weak notes, but da and ra only on strong notes. And he says the flute sound must not be interrupted during a connected phrase except at the end of the phrase, at a rest, or after a staccato dot. So the movement towards legato is very evident here. You can still see some tag-alongs from the Baroque era with all that articulation, but we're seeing this push towards those longer legato lines, which were in vogue in the classical. Even with staccato dots, that feeling that the tone is continued to be connected is important now. The sound should be considered like a thread with which notes are connected to one another by articulation. That concept that the air just keeps coming and the tongue is just doing the articulation, but the air is consistent. And he says, as I mentioned earlier, in slow movements, the dotted quavers are double dotted. And Tromlitz actually specifically says that this is still widespread, it's widely used. So the double dotting is still around late second half of 18th century. And 3 equal notes should be tongue, ta, a, da. And he says it's important to keep triplets even. There's lots on articulation in this treatise. So Tromlitz, spelt wrong, states that the fashion is to detach large intervals, but he disapproves of this practice. And that was definitely in the Baroque era, that large intervals were not slurred. But interestingly, now there's this shift. Actually, I don't like it when the leaps are detached. So we're moving away from that. So, and he suggested on dotted notes or tied notes, one can use the articulation ta, ha, with a gentle aspiration on the ha. So this ha should be barely noticeable, but it could help with the rhythm. So in this rhythm that I've written, da ba bum, he would articulate it ta ta ta. So that actually can be very helpful for the student to feel that extra pulse in there. And then he says, if a composer hasn't marked articulation, then add it. And he writes some suggestions there. And you notice he starts with two slurred, two tongued, which in the Baroque era wasn't all that common. But here, that's the one he starts with. So, and I think it's pretty obvious. There's just some varied articulations. But he also has the different suggestions on what syllables to use, ta ra 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 on the second last one, to get that mezzo staccato sound. Now, when it comes to ornamentation, so the addition of ornamentation and embellishment is not as much applicable to the classical era as it was in the Baroque. The performer had complete license in the Baroque. Now it's becoming less so, and we can see that in quants already, that there was this move towards, well, what the composer says goes. And he says, so when we're adding ornamentation, we must try to preserve the sentiment or the affect that is contained in the main theme. And then it is all right to make variations here and there. It's so common for a student to articulate things and then embellish things, and as they're embellishing them, they're changing the affect and changing the rhythm. So a sad piece becomes a happy piece, or a happy piece becomes a sad piece. And so he's saying, really preserve that sentiment. Whatever it starts, preserve that throughout. Always imagine the good singer and introduce artificialities only in those places that are no longer singable for a vocalist, but are suited exclusively to an instrument. So the way we ornament should be how a good singer would ornament. If we're going to do other things, okay, only outside the range that a vocalist would sing. And he says, pick ornaments that match the sentiment of a composition. If it's a slow piece, it's not going to have a super fast trill or a super fast acciaccatura. If it's a fast piece, it's not going to have a port of wire and a lower mordant slowly dragged through. So, and the interesting thing is that he uses the word ornament to also refer to slurs. There's many comments that slurs were ugly in the Baroque era. Only amateurs did them, and those sorts of things. They were really regarded as something that was special and to be used sparingly. And he's saying it's actually an ornament. And leave the first time you play the main theme, do not alter it. So leave it unvaried the first time, and then you can start embellishing it in subsequent times. Now, for double tonguing, sorry, can you not do that?
I've done.
I'm trying to use the internet. Can you please close Facebook? Sorry. Now, so he talks about the diddle tonguing. Diddle tonguing we don't use so much on the modern flute. Actually, it's very hard to do on a modern flute. Recorded players still do it. But Tromlitz actually says, well, very few do it correctly, and the ul syllable doesn't have the resonance of the first. But then, if he's thinking about, he's moving to a more resonant sound, where the early Baroque, that was less of an issue. So it was less of issue's not the word I want. It was less of their aim. So diddle, in his era, he's going, well, actually, no, the ul doesn't sound all that great. I want to keep that more equal tone across the syllables. And he doesn't mention tiki or tiri at all in the treatise. So clearly they're gone, out of fashion. He says when you do say the dul part of diddle, so he talks about it enough to know it's still around. When you say dul, push the air out of both sides of the tongue while the tongue is touching the soft palate to produce that separate note. So if there's 4 equal notes, you say ta-dul, 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 la-dul. Now on 3 equal notes, use ta-dul, da. And then after that, da-dul, da or ra-dul, da for each of the next 3 notes in the passage. with ornaments, after saying don't change the affect, he also says that they're indispensable and can never be left out. But take care not to misapply and overwhelm the melody. And remember that other treatises, Quantz has said the same thing. Oh, these amateur players who had so many ornaments that the composer's intention is no longer evident. Now, the essential ornaments he described is flatmon. And so not done with the breath like vibrato is, but with the fingers. And so, do I have a recorder in front of me? So an example of flatmon would be if I'm playing an A. So my vibrato is caused by shading the next hole, and that's flatmon. So he's saying don't shake the air like we do these days, but use flatmon to achieve that effect, and use it sparingly and only on long notes. The appoggiatura, he says, well, composers don't specify how long they want it to be, and he felt that they should. So, and he repeats what Quantz says, it's worth half or 2/3 of the written note. It's worth the full value of the written note if there's a rest following the written note, and then the written note's pushed onto the rest. He says swell or crescendo on the appoggiatura and tongue it gently. And the appoggiatura must fall on the beat, whether it's long or short. Remember that Quantz gave exceptions for the appoggiatura, and some of them did fall before the beat. So he talks about people adding notes onto a lower appoggiatura. So that's this example here. And then here he shows how to play it. And notice that the quaver takes they basically steal from the crotchet part of that A in order to realize that ornament in his suggestion. Still more on ornaments. Short appoggiatura. So if the dissonant note is the written note and not the appoggiatura, then the appoggiatura should be played short, because you don't want the dissonance to become the consonants. So if the appoggiatura is the consonants, play it short. Passing appoggiaturas take their value from the note before. So passing appoggiaturas occur before the beat. However, Tromlitz does mention that this is debatable by his era. When there is a written out appoggiatura and then an extra appoggiatura, then the extra one would be played before the beat. Again, that's different to what he just wrote in his previous example. Short appoggiaturas are used in faster movements, and long appoggiaturas are used in slow movements. And appoggiaturas that are made of two notes take the value from the note before. So it's not always consistent, but it gives some idea. And you know what this also tells us is that the whole the appoggiatura is always on the beat is not actually that clear cut in Baroque and early classical understanding. So slides, two little notes before the note, are played on the beat. A double appoggiatura, which is a note below, and the note above the main note is on the beat. These are his terminologies, not mine. The gruppetto turn, that's no different to now. Mordent can be used freely on both strong and weak notes. It can start with an upper appoggiatura, or it can start on the written note if the upper note precedes it. The lower mordent, which was called a batmon, he describes, Quantz and Hotteday call the lower mordent a batmon. He uses the term batmon to refer to a long trill with the note below the written note, which is also called a groppo. He talks about use of dynamic contrast as an ornament, and glissando, gliding off the finger hole. And the interesting thing was, he describes this glissando effect as being very fashionable at this present time, although he doesn't think it should be overused. He describes the trill of a third, like C goes to E, as being worthless. So clearly these are no longer valued in good taste. In playing a trill, he says, divide the beat up equally and decide exactly how many notes you will play in your trill. So trills should be equal and measured as opposed to the free trill that's quite common these days. So sometimes we go, oh, don't tell the student how many notes to put in a trill. I'm a control freak. I tell them how many notes I want them to put in the trill, at least for the first few grades that they're playing trills. But that's also stylistically correct according to Tromlitz. A trill in the course of a melody needs an upper appoggiatura to begin it, and the appoggiatura will take half or 2/3 of the value of the written note before the trill begins. And every trill must have a termination. Again, this is sort of a new thing, that the lower two notes at the end of the trill is, well, yeah. Avoid putting too much weight on the upper note of the trill. The main note should always sound like the main note. So we want to know what's the melody note, and then the trill is just decorating it. And choose the speed of the trill by what the tempo of the movement is. Now he talks about fermatas, and when he says fermata, he really means a cadenza. But he says about these cadenzas, they must not be too long, and they must function as a sort of lead into the return of the theme, and they must maintain the sentiment of the piece. I know with violin in particular, Leopold Auer wrote these cadenzas, which was so inappropriately to the historical style, and so long and so difficult. They didn't maintain the sentiment. They're brilliant, but they don't maintain the sentiment of the piece. So, and the other thing that strikes me about this is when I see a pause in a piece of classical music, is it a pause, or is it one of these cadenza type fermata signs? I don't have an answer though. And these are things he says about cadenzas. The freedom of cadenzas is abused these days. The extensive frippery before the final trill that the concerto or solo player has the liberty to play. And then he says about the length of the trill, the wind player should be limited to the length of their breath, and it should be appropriate to the main emotion of the piece. Another, I can't remember which treatise said, the cadenza should be limited to the length of the breath. However, when you're performing it, you can do it in 2 breaths. But when you're preparing it, aim for what you can do in the length of 1 breath. A cadenza should not contain too many ideas, and the cadenza should use the most fitting ideas from the movement which it's in. So use the ideas that are already in the movement to make the cadenza rather than introducing something new. Cadenzas should have freedom in the beat and the pulse. There should be no modulation in them. However, they could allude to the subdominant or dominant. Oh yes, no, it was Tromlitz who said, while the cadenza should be playable in 1 breath, you don't actually have to perform it in 1 breath. There you go, I should have just not tried to add anything to what I wrote. So breathing. Inappropriate breaths break up the melody and make them incomprehensible, and they disrupt the listener's attention. It's pretty obvious, isn't it? Do not breathe after an upbeat, i.e. the last note of the bar. So don't breathe on the bar line. You can breathe after a tied note before a run of semiquavers, and in a long semiquaver passage you may need to drop out a note which is on the strong beat to take a breath. If the last note of a semiquaver passage is a passing note, it can be omitted. However, it's best to use the air wisely so that we don't need any extra breaths, but at least we've got in case of emergency, a few ideas there. Embellishment. When people ask, why should we learn theory? Here Tromlitz nails it on the head. Knowledge of harmony is required in order to embellish well. The embellishment and the variations must match the context of the melody. Do not try and vary everything, and ornaments and embellishment can be combined together. So when we are decorating a melody, in whichever way we're decorating it, you must maintain the character of the melody, but also maintain the recognizability, if that's a word, of the melody. So he talks about the accompaniment in his era, and he mentions the harpsichord, the clavichord, and the forte piano. But he says he prefers the harpsichord. He says due to its strong and sustained tone. And the harpsichord is not an instrument I would describe as sustained, which makes me think maybe the forte piano wasn't very good at sustaining its notes in this era, and so the harpsichord was better. But that's only my surmising, because I've never played a forte piano, and definitely not one in the 1750s. Now, he says about teaching that learning to beat in time and play rhythms in time should actually precede playing music. It makes me think of in Mr. Holland's opus, Mr. Someone's opus, and he says that the older teachers would beat the student on the head to learn rhythm before they started playing, so that it went straight through to their brain. Now, I had to pick, after giving you a lovely recipe for lip salve, I also had to pick some exciting quotes from the treatise. So the first one is, through vehemence and bitter words people do not improve each other, for neither will yield, and thus the truth suffers and does not become known for certain. A good master can have bad pupils insofar as they do not strictly follow what the teacher instructs, but a bad master can never produce good pupils. It is impossible for someone to teach to another what he himself does not know. So what's the moral of the story? Professional development, guys! Anyway, I'll put the cheer squad in the forum later. So now the prospective musician is well advised to strive higher and higher, thinking all the time about what is doing and what he is doing and learning to do, and trying to get things straight by pondering and reflecting on them continuously, no matter how old we get. I don't think I've ever stopped studying. It's probably an unhealthy obsession, but always striving higher and higher, always reflecting, what can I do better? In that lesson, can we put the dog out the back, please? It's a bit noisy. I'm playing this, what can I make better? Not sitting on our laurels going, well, I did my licentiate, so no, I'm fine, but still listening. What can I still improve? And then this is my favorite from the whole book. Most people are without knowledge and have not learned to think, and therefore are about as grown up as mushrooms. And then here's a few final pedagogical thoughts from Mr. Tromlitz. The student must seek to play his piece so to be understood by the listener. We're playing for an exam or a concert. It doesn't matter what we think we're playing. What it matters is, what does the audience hear? Do we effectively get our concept across to the audience? If we don't, then we've failed it. We need to make sure the audience understands what we're doing. And then in quick movements, one must be careful not to overdo the speed. Be careful not to always play in one color, plodding on flat and shapeless. Always make our music shaped and beautiful. And it is the teacher's duty to remind his pupils to practice every passage frequently and with proper attention until it is successful. Of course, the pupil will not learn such a lot of tunes one after another by this method, but he will learn thoroughly. And the smaller the steps seem to be in the beginning, the greater they will be when some time has been spent practicing this way. It's just like the pyramid. The bottom layer is the biggest. And without that really good foundation, you can't build the rest of the pyramid. It will topple or crumble or something. So that we don't need to focus on how many songs can our student learn, but how thoroughly can they learn. And yeah, in the beginning, the steps might seem to be really small, but it's worth it to not rush through the beginning. Get that beginning super solid, because then progress is fast later. But the other opposite way doesn't work. If we skip over the foundations, then the higher grades become insurmountable. I think that's my last page. So what I'll do is I will stop sharing if I can. Can I stop sharing? Maybe. Stop share. And I will say goodbye to people who are watching on the live stream. So then if people who are in the room have something they want to add, they can feel free to. So 1 second, and I'll just stop the live